Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this book launch, which is hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society here at King's. I'm Mark Pennington, and I'm the director of the centre. So, managing uncertainty is a central theme of our ongoing project on the political economy of knowledge and ignorance, as is understanding the role of entrepreneurial action in mitigating that uncertainty. The question of which institutional environments are most conducive to successful entrepreneurship is one of the core questions of political economy. And the book we are launching this evening represents a highly nuanced contribution to our understanding of the kind of governance institutions that facilitate or inhibit entrepreneurship and the socio-economic development that goes with it. I'm really pleased to be hosting this particular book launch, in part because I think the book itself should be widely read. I think it's an excellent book, but also because of the identity of its author. If you've attended some of our recent events, and we've had over 1,000 people actually attend our events since November of last year, then I'm sure you'll appreciate there's a great deal of organisation goes in behind the scenes to actually putting on one of these events, including the event this evening. And I'm delighted to say that the person who's been doing much of that organisation is my colleague, Dr. Brian Chang. He is our speaker this evening, and it's his book that we are launching. Brian has produced a superb book, and I'm really delighted that we are launching it at our centre. So Brian's going to speak for around 45 minutes to an hour, and then we're going to take question and answers. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Brian Chang to introduce his book, Economic Liberalism and the Developmental State, Comparing Singapore and Hong Kong's Post-War Development.
Thank you very much. For those of you who do not know me, I'm a research fellow at the Centre. Before that, I completed my PhD in political economy at King's. Before that, I was a civil servant in the Singapore government, where I spent several years in economic policy making. Before that, I was a graduate of the National University of Singapore. So this book basically is a comparative case study of two countries, Hong Kong and Singapore's post-war development. The reason why I compare these two countries is because they are two of the most successful cases in the classroom of development. Both are typically considered as economic twins. They are former British colonies, majority Chinese population, similar geographical status as city-states and as trade entrepôts. So they provide a very good cases for a comparative analysis. So the period of focus that I'm looking at is actually all the way up to the year 2000, mainly focusing on the rapid development of both countries in a late 20th century context. So this study here is related to wider debates about the nature of East Asia and East Asia's development. So there are generally two schools of thought that I'm trying to respond to. On one hand, we have market liberal economists, people like Milton Friedman, okay? And these economists usually see economic freedom as the prime mover of developmental success. And they portray East Asia's success as a product of economic freedom and free market capitalism. On the other hand, we have what we call developmental state theories. People like Ha-Joon Chang, Robert Wade, Stephen Haggart, and many more. According to them, it is not the invisible hand of free markets, but the visible arm of government that transformed East Asia and led to its rapid success. So my position is actually different from both of them. So I argue that both positions are only partially correct. So I agree with the second group that the state market arrangements in East Asia are by no means close to free market capitalism. They did not really follow the neoliberal, laissez-faire free market approaches that people in the development community were recommending at the time. So I agree with this group of scholars. But at the same time, I also show in this book that the top-down strategies, to the extent that these were used, there were severe costs, limitations, and trade-offs that occurred. So there are two research questions that I'm exploring here in this book. The first part of the book, basically, I explore what are the differences in state market arrangements in Singapore and Hong Kong? What are the differences in their development approaches? And with this first part, I then go into the second part. I explore and evaluate the results of these institutional differences, and I ask the question, how can we comparatively assess their economic achievements? And once we have this comparative analysis, we might be able to draw some insights for other countries. But first, why should we care about this topic? Because this story of Singapore and Hong Kong is part of a wider academic literature of the East Asian model of governance, which according to many scholars poses a challenge to Western liberal democratic capitalism. And this challenge exists on two levels. On the first level, on the political economy level, East Asia is said to have developed under very interventionist developmental state arrangements, rather than laissez-faire minimal state free markets. In terms of political theory, East Asia is said to favor political meritocracy, Confucian governance, which supposedly challenges the assumptions that liberal democracy is the best for the entire world. And this is not just an academic debate. It's actually related to the rise of China, right, which adopts this model and which seeks to really challenge the supremacy of liberal democracy. And China is a revisionist power in the world that wants to challenge liberal governance. And so we have this book here called The China Model, written by political theorist Daniel Bell, published by Princeton University Press. Many of such books coming up recently, published by this same publisher, right, focusing on the nature of East Asia and how it challenges liberal governance. So I believe that my comparison with Singapore and Hong Kong provides us a way to consider these bigger questions. So going on to the first part of my presentation, what exactly are the state market arrangements that we see in Singapore and Hong Kong, and how are they different? So this is a very popular perspective that we see in the media today. It's called Singapore on Thames. The idea here, according to many market liberals, is that Singapore is a free market model to be emulated, both by developing countries and by developed countries. So there are some prominent examples, which I'm showing you on the screen here. So that's former MEP Daniel Hannan. Singapore-style economy isn't a threat, it's a growth strategy. So this perspective is popular with many free market Brexiteers, right, who say that the UK, post-Brexit, should copy the low taxes, business-friendly policies, and free trade of Singapore. That's Professor Steve Hank from the American Context. He has written a series of articles saying that developing countries like Paraguay, Uruguay, and different other developing nations should follow the Singapore strategy. And by that, he means low taxes, free market capitalism. Cato Institute, Singapore reflecting the power of economic freedom. So this is actually quite a pervasive point of view. And this perspective actually stems from research from what I call economic freedom indices, EFI in short. These are actually metrics created by two free market organizations in the United States, the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute. So, Index of Economic Freedom by Heritage Foundation and Economic Freedom of the World Index by Fraser Institute. So these metrics measure things like size of government, tax rates, regulatory burden, sound money, degree of tariffs and protectionism, and institutional quality. How strongly are property rights protected, and whether or not there's the rule of law. So these organizations and various free market economists in that orbit argue that East Asia's rise, especially Hong Kong and Singapore, is really because of the power of economic freedom. And both, if you actually check the rankings right now on your phone, you will see they are consistently ranked as the freest economies in the world. And according to the Fraser Index, Singapore has now become number one, the freest economy in the world. I strongly object to this characterization. So the first part of my book strongly objects to this characterization on the basis that it is very simplistic and reductionist. Okay? And the key argument I'm making today is this. I argue that the use of aggregate statistics obscures the complex exercises of state power and the social historical context within which capitalist arrangements are embedded. So I'm going to make this argument in the following slides. So even though Hong Kong and Singapore are ranked as top 2 freest economies, there are a lot of institutional differences between them which are very nuanced and complex, which these aggregate statistics cannot capture. Let me argue this more deeply. So the reason why I come from a very different perspective is because I adopt a very different methodology. And methodologies are related to social science ontologies, the way you understand the world, the way you understand the nature of the empirical universe. So in this book, I adopt a small n case study approach. Okay? And this is a case study expert, John Gearing, case study research, and I would like to quote certain excerpts from this book. So John Gearing writes, the choice between a case study, which means small n employing thick description, and cross-case style of analysis, by that he means large n aggregate statistics, thin description, the choice between these two approaches is driven by the shape of the empirical universe that the researcher is attempting to understand. The logic of cross-case analysis is premised on some degree of cross-unit comparability or homogeneity. Cases must be similar to each other in whatever respects might affect the causal relationship that the writer is investigating, or such differences must be controlled for. Case study researchers are often suspicious of large sample research, and I'm one of these people, which they suspect contains heterogeneous cases whose differences cannot be easily modeled. Variable-oriented research is said to involve unrealistic homogenizing assumptions. Case study researchers tend to have a lumpy vision of the world. They see countries, communities, and persons as highly individualized phenomena. Cross-case researchers usually have a less differentiated version of the world. They are more likely to believe that things are pretty much the same everywhere, according to John Gearing. And I subscribe, indeed, to a case study approach to social science. And in the context of political economy, there is a well-established academic literature called Varieties of Capitalism, or VOC in short. And this literature actually establishes that capitalist institutions around the world do not converge on a universal mode. In fact, they diverge significantly. They diverge in different clusters. So if you have read some of this literature before, you would have come across the very classic book by Hall and Soskis, differentiating between liberal market economies and coordinated market economies. The one that has influenced me a lot is the account by William Baumol, who distinguishes state capitalism with big firm capitalism with entrepreneurial capitalism. And this VOC literature stems from a particular worldview that straddles universalism and particularism on the other hand. According to institutional economist Geoff Hodgson, paper in 2016, there is a universal essence of capitalism, which makes a capitalist nation, let's say, different from a socialist one. There are some core defining characteristics. But nonetheless, this essence is manifested in divergent ways in local contexts. And if you notice a lot of VOC scholars, they usually engage in small and comparative case studies, employing thick description, a range of different methods, various data points, right, allowing them to create rich and textured comparisons of institutions across nations. And so I think that these economic freedom indices and people who are using these indices to paint a certain impression of East Asia, Singapore, and Hong Kong are creating a very misleading impression. Because in my opinion, EFI is an economistic and an aggregate metric. What do I mean by economistic? it only looks at economic freedom, but it does not show you how this economic freedom is embedded within culture, is embedded within a social political context, and how this context shapes economic freedom. And economic freedom is actually stripped out and looked at as a measurable quantity to be ranked across the globe. And this is related to the second characteristic, which is that it is an aggregate indicator. It is large N, 100 plus countries on this ranking, and employs thin description, so the institutional details of specific regions abstracted away. So do not get me wrong, I think this metric, Economic Freedom Index, is great, but it depends on what you're using it for, right? So usually free market economies, they use these metrics to establish certain relationships. So they will say things like, the more free your economy is, you tend to have higher levels of environmental quality, subjective happiness, gender equality, things like that. So there is actually some use, I think, of EFI. But if your aim is to capture specific varieties of capitalism and understand certain regions and their uniqueness, you cannot just observe aggregate statistics. So I'm actually making more of a qualitative argument rather than a quantitative one. Okay, so this is a very important clarification I always have to make when I give a version of this talk. Because I'm not saying that Singapore should be ranked differently or that these metrics are ranking countries incorrectly. Because if I'm making such an argument, then I have to produce quantitative data and justify why the calculation methods, the calculation approaches in these indices should be revised. There are many scholars who are experts on these indices who have proposed variations over the years, totally irrelevant for my context. So my point is that institutional arrangements are very embedded in local, social, cultural, political contexts and belief systems, which introduces an element of incommensurability. Okay? So EFI treats economic freedom as a uniformly measurable entity across the world, does not capture the unique textures of specific institutional arrangements. So you see here an image of three-dimensional objects. Okay, so you have a cylinder, you have a cube and a sphere. A cube and a sphere may have the same volume, but you cannot say they are the same objects. They are qualitatively different objects. So the magnitude of economic freedom is important, is one thing. We should definitely understand the magnitude of economic freedom, but that's not the same as the form, the structure of capitalist arrangements. So what I'm actually interested in this book is what I call character of control. And this actually comes from a very famous market liberal economist, Peter Bauer, who wrote in 1969. He writes, I quote him, "These political results or corollaries of state control of economic life depend largely on the closest and types of state control of economic life, matters which cannot be inferred simply from conventional statistics of the size of the public sector. For instance, government expenditure may be comparatively small, and yet government control over the economy close if there are many state trading monopolies or if there is extensive licensing of economic activity. Therefore, in assessing the political implications of state control of economic life, the character of control is of major relevance, and this character cannot be inferred from readily accessible statistics." Close quote. So, in this book, in the first part, I'm actually comparing the character of control of the state in Singapore and in Hong Kong. So, having established all these methods and principles, I now actually dive deeper into Singapore and Hong Kong. So this is a table here. I apologize in advance if you can't see this. I'm happy to share with you the slides. So in the first part of the book, I control the nature of Singapore's economic management and political management of the state. So let me run through one at a time. On the first level on the left-hand side, in Singapore, there is heavy use of industrial policy. Okay? I know this because I used to administer some of this industrial policy in the Singapore government. Okay? Since Singapore's independence of 1960s, there are numerous 5-year plans, 10-year plans to promote certain sectors, technologies, and firms over the years. But in Hong Kong, the same simply cannot be said. there is a virtual absence of national economic plans. It is actually only after Hong Kong's handover to China at the turn of the 21st century that more of these sectoral demands from specific industries have started to arise. Not only do they differ in terms of the use of industrial policy, okay, in Singapore there's also the extensive presence of what we call government-linked entities in the stock market and in parts of the economy. According to my calculation, I did some original calculations where I have to literally search hundreds of these annual reports and budgets to compile a new data set. Almost 45% of the stock market capitalization of Singapore's economy is actually dominated and somehow linked to these government-linked entities. But in the Hong Kong context, state-owned enterprises are far and few between. They're quite minimal. And in terms of strategic control over certain aspects of the economy, we see they are quite different. So there is one similarity between both countries in the sense that land is monopolized by the state, okay, in Singapore and Hong Kong. So that's one similarity. But in terms of labor markets and capital, very different. In Singapore, there is extensive use of manpower planning. There's extensive use of central wage bargaining, labor negotiations. So a lot of the outcomes in the labor markets are subject to national economic plans. And the flow of capital as well has also been significantly influenced in the Singapore context by significant industrial policy interventions. The generous slew of subsidies which are being provided by the Singapore state. Favorable development loans given by banks to specific entrepreneurs and firms. Government investments directly by the state and in partnership with multinational corporations. So the industrial structure, the economic structure of the Singapore economy heavily engineered by the state in ways that are simply non-existent in the Hong Kong context. But economic management is always related to politics as well. We can't divorce economics and politics. So in terms of politics, this is where things are a bit more interesting. So in Singapore, there is free elections, regular elections, generally fair, sometimes not so fair. The Singaporeans in the room will know what I mean. In Hong Kong, there has not, for the longest time, Hong Kongers, you can't elect, right? You can't elect the officials, the colonial governor, for example, even though there are some local level elections. So even though actually Singapore has electoral freedoms, right, but Hong Kong doesn't have much electoral freedoms, Singapore does not have a tradition of civil liberties. When it comes to civil liberties, it is actually flipped in reverse. Okay? Civil liberties in Singapore heavily suppressed by the state, but in Hong Kong there has been a tradition of civil liberties. But of course, I understand it's increasingly encroached on by China since 1997. So not only is there a difference in terms of the formal political system, this one here is very important as well. Let me read it out. In Singapore context, state power, the exercise of state power has involved some degree of ideological and cultural hegemony. Because state power is not just the force of arms, it's the ability to influence people's values as well, people's mindsets. And I think this is a reflection of social engineering through the education system, through various social institutions. But in Hong Kong, for the longest time under the colonial state, there simply has not been the practice of social engineering. So state-society relations are really at an arm's length relationship. There's a huge gap in state-society relations, but in the Singapore context, the state is really involved in social relations. Okay, so there is a huge difference in political culture. Therefore, in Singapore, we have what we call an authoritarian developmental state capitalist system with a very disciplined citizenry. But in Hong Kong, it's different. It's entrepreneurial capitalism under a tradition of liberal politics, even though rights are being eroded, with a robust civil society. So with this small n approach, I would like to introduce this very important term. It's a German word, Verstehen. It's a term associated with sociologist Max Weber and loosely translated as to understand. So I argue that aggregate statistics may aid in prediction or measurement across many cases, but if you just look at the statistics, and just look at it in isolation, it cannot provide this Verstehen quality of understanding of the local context. And if you do not have such contextual knowledge and understanding, okay, you might make some very foolish statements and prescriptions. What do I mean by this? Being in the UK for some time, I hear it all the time. The UK should build lots of infrastructure like Singapore. Yes, that's partly correct. But all this building, construction, and in fact the physical alteration of the landscape in Singapore is possible and very easy due to high state capacity and the absence of interest groups. People in the UK say, oh, we need to build more houses and infrastructure. But there are a lot of vested interests. The state, you can't just override it. In Singapore, you want to build more houses? Done. No debate, no opposition. The UK should follow Singapore's wonderful healthcare system where the state doesn't really spend a lot. Well, yes, true, very efficient, so I agree with that. But if you don't have the local understanding, you will not realize, okay, that this is enabled so the state doesn't spend a lot on healthcare in Singapore because of what we call Central Provident Fund. There's this thing called a forced savings scheme, right, which all Singaporeans are subject to. This is not income tax. It's income tax with this additional element which you cannot opt out of. Okay, so if you're forced to save, and you are forced to contribute to this account, you can use it for healthcare. And so, of course, yes, the state does not have to come in. Okay, and such a scheme, such an institution will be very unpopular in many democratic countries. So the key point is that capitalism in Singapore and a lot of these policies are embedded in an authoritarian political context, unlike Hong Kong and in many countries. So if you say, okay, you want to plug policy A from context A, you bring it to context B, the condition that made it possible in context A is not present in context B. So when you drop it there, it may not actually work out. So you actually need contextual knowledge. Okay? Now, I would like to further contrast Singapore and Hong Kong on this very interesting aspect in terms of the use of data, in terms of the use of big data technologies. So I argue that actually both countries have very divergent attitudes towards the use of statistics, data, and big data, which reflects different characters of control by the state. So CSGS has been hosting a lot of events on statistics and big data over the last few weeks if you've been attending. So I provide some empirical manifestation of this here. Okay, in post-war Hong Kong, actually, colonial administrators refused to collect macroeconomic statistics. So in the 1960s, free market economist Milton Friedman visited Hong Kong. He wanted to study Hong Kong's economy. He said, show me the statistics. Show me what's going on. And John Cowperthwaite, who was the financial secretary for more than 10 years, he said, once data is published, there will be pressure to use them for government intervention in the economy. Refused to collect macroeconomic statistics. And the Guardian newspaper, in an obituary for Cowperthwaite, recalled that he was once asked, what is the number one thing, the key thing that poor countries can do to improve their growth? And guess what he said? They should abolish the Office of National Statistics. Okay? So you see, it's very different characters of control. But in the Singapore context, it could not be more different. Okay, Singapore governance is very technocratic and what I call high modernist. It is not as dystopian as China's social credit system, so I'm not insinuating it's like China. But big data algorithms, scenario planning, statistical modeling routinely used by civil service at a national level policy making. I've interviewed people on this. I used to do some of this myself when I was working there. And this is not just surveillance, okay? It's not just surveillance state. In the West, we may have like surveillance mechanisms. But in Singapore, a lot of this is used for social engineering purposes. So even the physical layout of houses, the racial composition of Chinese, Malay, Indians, how it's to be distributed in flats, in public housing, is also subject to careful planning. So there is this thing called the Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning System. It sounds very scary. Okay, so please check it out. You can Google it. It was a subject of an article by Foreign Policy magazine written in 2014. And also in Singapore, because we rely on performance legitimacy, GDP statistics usually also feed into performance legitimacy. So the idea is that if we have such high economic growth reflected in GDP, which is going up so rapidly, perhaps, it's okay if I suspend your civil liberties. Do not demand freedom if I provide you with a good life. Right? So there is that sort of a trade-off in terms of economic growth and civil liberties in Singapore governance, and is reinforced through discourse, through the rhetoric of the Singapore elites. What about the rule of law? What about the rule of law, which we know is very important, which EFI metrics actually measure in the aggregate statistics? Let me share a story with you. In October 2007, more than 4,000 lawyers from many countries converged upon Singapore for the International Bar Association's annual conference. The selection of Singapore as a venue was actually very controversial because some members protested that the IBA was lending legitimacy to a regime that had violated the rule of law. Lee Kuan Yew, I think all of you know Lee Kuan Yew, he gave a keynote address at this conference, and he started to pull out a series of statistics and tables citing Singapore's high rankings on Rule of Law Index, which exists. You can Google Rule of Law Index by the World Bank, as proof of the existence of the rule of law in Singapore. What happened after he pulled out these statistics? According to press reports, and this is documented, you can check it out, the audience burst out into laughter. Why is that so? According to legal scholar Jyoti Raja, this incident represented a discursive minimization of the rule of law from a qualitative ideal to schemas that rank and quantify. This is actually the book published by Cambridge University Press. She's a legal scholar, actually the ex-wife of the current law minister in Singapore. How does that work? Okay, so Jyoti Raja here actually, she's using Foucauldian power analysis. She employs Foucault in this book. And she shows that rule of law under Singapore's authoritarianism was discursively transformed into rule by law, where religion, media, society, and even physical bodies themselves were heavily policed and disciplined by legal instruments. Okay, let me provide a specific example. Okay, so in the aspect of judicial corporal punishment, so as you know, Singapore is one of the few countries that retain the death penalty and corporal punishment. And in 1994, there was a very famous incident. Some of you may be old enough to remember this. There was this American teenager called Michael Fay, charged with vandalism, sentenced to caning, which prompted an uproar in American media and by the US government. Singapore officials insisted that no exceptions can be made. We need to go ahead with this punishment, caning of this guy. Due to rule of law, we need to be consistently applying the law. And here's what's interesting. They framed the entire incident and the entire situation in terms of Singapore's legal system being based on Confucian values, which are superior to the individual rights of the West. Okay? So the discourse, the rhetoric was that in the liberal West there's too much freedom. It leads to moral decay. All right? I would like to read out two quotes by former ministers Goh Chok Tong and Lee Kuan Yew. And they were speaking this in the context of the Michael Fay incident in the 1990s. In America, not me, this is Goh Chok Tong and Lee Kuan Yew. In America, indulgent upbringing of children has brought sorry consequences. If you slap your child for unruly behavior, you risk going to jail. At a grocery store in Georgia, a 9-year-old boy picked on his sister and was rude to his mother. The mother slapped him. A police officer saw red marks on the boy's face, asked if he had been slapped before, and the boy said, "I am slapped when I'm bad." The mother was handcuffed and hauled to jail for child abuse. She was released on 33,000 bail. The charges were later dropped not because the police felt they were wrong, but because they feared they could not prove to the courts that the mother's slapping had caused excessive pain to her son. The country, referring to the US and the West, dares not restrain or punish the individuals, forgiving them for whatever they have done. This is why the whole country is in chaos. Drugs, violence, unemployment and homelessness, all sorts of problems in its society. Singapore's stand is that the government must protect society, if not there'll be chaos. Most Singaporeans believe group interests should prevail. That's the right thing to do. For if we listen to the Americans, to the West, things will go downhill. We will not progress, socio-economically progress. The West regards society as serving individual interests, while the East places importance on the group. So the implication is that Singapore is a Confucian-oriented Asian society where the state has a right to enforce tough social discipline through law and other means to preserve social order. So state-led development in Singapore is built on disciplinary mechanisms to cultivate a compliant population, diverting energies away from political activism into economic production. So this is a very important diagram here. Many people, if you just read the news, you'll be very familiar with how China has been interfering into Hong Kong, right? Encroaching on civil liberties. So we don't need any explanation for the first part. But not a lot of people are aware of the other arrow, actually, of how actually China has sought to learn from and borrow many authoritarian practices of Singapore and bring it into China. Why? Because there is a desire to reap the fruits of economic growth, right? So I have some markets, I have partial liberalization in economic growth, but I retain political control, right? So this is not capitalism and freedom. This is capitalism without freedom. So China has been more capitalist over the years, but they have not become more liberal, okay? And this is actually from this excellent book, China's Singapore Model and Authoritarian Learning, by Stephen Ottman and Mark Thompson. So if you do not buy my book, you should at least read this one. This is actually really good. Okay? Right. So now let me move on to the second part of my presentation, which is, so what are the results of these differences? Right? What are the effects which have manifested themselves? How can we assess their economic achievements? So both countries have adopted very different approaches to development. So Singapore's post-war development was state-directed, where multinational corporations and government-linked corporations were the key players to jumpstart industrialization. Agencies like Economic Development Board and Enterprise Singapore, where I used to work, spearheads industrial policy. But in Hong Kong, actually, no such central direction took place. But it was driven rather by what I call adaptive entrepreneurs in a post-war period. And many of these entrepreneurs actually were migrants. Migrants from China, especially Shanghainese migrants. And this is one very famous example. Okay? Sir Yue Kong Pao in Hong Kong. Okay? Remarkable entrepreneur and philanthropist who made significant contributions to Hong Kong's development, son of a shoe seller who became one of the world's richest men, born in China, moved to Hong Kong in 1949, began his career in shipping industry. There are a lot more. It's not just him. There were huge numbers of migrants coming in, especially escaping China. So there was industrialization, yes, but this industrialization was a bottom-up process, right? So the economy before industrialization was dependent on entrepot trade, but slowly evolved into manufacturing, consumer electronics, and then subsequently services. Okay? So there is a very big difference in terms of how both systems view entrepreneurship. In a Singapore context, I like to quote Albert Winsemius, who was a technical advisor that influenced Singapore's industrialization plan. There was no industrial sector to speak of. This is what the state believed at that time. And we did not advise to build up such a sector either. Goh Keng Swee, considered Singapore's economic architect, we imported entrepreneurs in the form of multinational corporations. And the government itself became an entrepreneur in a big way. So when you hear about entrepreneurial state, the discourse on entrepreneurial state today, well, Singapore was an entrepreneurial state way before this became popular. In Hong Kong, John Cowperthwaite, the financial secretary, says, in the long run, the aggregate of decisions of individuals exercising individual judgment, even if often mistaken, is less likely to do harm than the centralized decisions of a government, and certainly the harm is likely to be counteracted faster. And once again, these divergent attitudes reflect very different worldviews. In Singapore, I would like to quote Goh Keng Swee again. There is this technocratic, high modernist mindset at work, which drives its development strategy. According to Goh Keng Swee, a key civic responsibility of political elites, the intelligentsia and other informed citizens, is to help hasten and facilitate the transformation of the traditional segment of the population into a modern, which is rational, hardworking, sober, disciplined, accumulating, and achievement-oriented body of people. Okay? And I'd like to quote now Cowperthwaite, this guy again, and I read, they, the technocrats and the interventionists, are guilty of the 20th century fallacy that technology can be applied to the conduct of human affairs. They cannot believe that anything can work efficiently unless it has been programmed by a computer, and have lost faith in the forces of the market and the human actions and reactions that make it up. But no computer has yet been devised which will produce accurate results from a diet of opinion and emotion. We suffer a great deal today from the bogus certainties and precisions of the pseudosciences, which include all the social sciences, including economics. Technology is admirable on the factory floor, but largely irrelevant to human affairs. So, what are the results of both approaches? Well, great increases of GDP. But you see, Singapore is the line in red. GDP of Singapore seems to have eclipsed. So perhaps the technocratic approach is better. Well, from a GDP national income perspective, yes, true. But then again, I say there's a lot more at work. It can be quite misleading. Yes, both countries achieve rapid GDP growth, but there are structural differences in their relative achievements owing to their different approaches. Due to the state-driven approach in Singapore, indigenous entrepreneurs are not significant. They have been crowded out by big MNCs and government-linked corporations as compared to Hong Kong, where adaptive entrepreneurs take center stage. So in part 2 of the book, I examine productivity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and very importantly, what I call creative culture, where Hong Kong excels despite absence of government support and funding for those areas. So I provide a mix of evidence. There are some statistics, but with thick description and triangulation. So let us start with history. Okay? Let us start with history. I have a rather unpopular opinion. British colonialism was rather beneficial in both colonies. This is not out of the goodness of their heart, but due to fortuitous circumstances, because I argue that there was a tabula rasa sort of a situation in the early 19th century, which allowed British governance to be established without much social opposition, because Hong Kong and Singapore, they were rather sparsely populated, okay, when the British arrived. So after the British arrived, legal, political, economic institutions were established. There were many migrants from China flocking to Hong Kong and Singapore. They not only excelled economically, but they also became what I call governance partners of the British. So I draw from economic historian Joan Mokyr, who shows that culture and institutions influence each other. Similarly, in my case, I show there was a huge degree of what I call bourgeois values, which linked the local Chinese community and the British community. So it interacted, making Anglo-Chinese capitalism in Hong Kong and Singapore very successful. So what is the significance of this? Even before Singapore became a developmental state, when it became independent in 1965, there were already seeds of industrialization and a burgeoning consumer class. Of course, it should not be exaggerated, okay? But it's not true to say that, Singapore was like a swamp, right? From third world to first world, right? That is also an exaggeration, okay? So I think in chapter 5 of my book, I employ consumer advertisements, right? Which reflect the emergence of a consumer class. So this is an advertisement of some automobiles which are trying to target the female community. So women were starting to become more upwardly mobile in the Singapore context, and so they are being targeted. So there was a burgeoning, not a big one, but a burgeoning consumer class. So I have further elaborated on this in a recent paper I've published in the Journal of Development Studies. Feel free to check it out to derive the full argument. So I'm about to bring this to a close. In the Singapore context, however, in the post-war period of the 1950s and 1960s, when migrant entrepreneurs were flocking to Hong Kong, Singapore persecuted, actually, domestic Chinese small, medium enterprises, which had flourished under the British. Now, you might think, why would you persecute businesses? Okay? 2 reasons. Because of politics. The English-speaking faction of the Chinese community, led by Lee Kuan Yew, had to compete against a rival power base of traditional Chinese-speaking leaders. So one example of this competition was this guy, Tan Lak Sai, a leading rubber industrialist and community leader. He was stripped of his citizenship. And the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce at the time was being disciplined and marginalized, politically speaking. And there was also a high modernist mindset at work here. So Lee Kuan Yew has stated that the old family business, referring to the Chinese traditional SMEs, is one of the problems of Singapore. It is not so with European or foreign enterprise. So the SME sector since then have been overshadowed by the so-called English-speaking, modern, westernized global capital, government-linked corporations and MNCs. Let us now fast forward. Okay, fast forward to present day. So yes, Singapore has done well in many indicators. That cannot be denied. If you take a plane to Changi Airport, you will see skyscrapers and all those great stuff. But it has come at a cost. So look at entrepreneurial culture. This is a survey by the World Economic Forum. Comparing some Southeast Asian countries here, Singapore, youths are least likely to express a desire to become an entrepreneur. So if you think entrepreneurship is important in economic development, then you will be quite concerned about this. Okay? And if you are a Singaporean, you would have heard of a lot of stereotypes and news reports of the Singapore education system trying to promote and grow entrepreneurship, right? And so in order to triangulate and to further study this, I conducted my own survey. And this is a survey question that I administered, and I asked the question, I prefer being a salaried employee for stable and comfortable income rather than being my own boss. So you can check my methodology in the book. A few hundred respondents in each country. You see, someone from Hong Kong is more likely to disagree with this sentence. They are more likely to want to be an entrepreneur. Okay, now, this is very interesting. So globally prominent local entrepreneurs are rare and actually in Singapore's history. But there are some. And the first prominent one is this guy called Sim Wong Hoo, founder of Creative Industries. I see some Singaporeans smiling, right? And this guy who named his company Creative Industries was actually critical of the lack of a creative culture in Singapore. Okay, and he coined the term, this is Sim Wong Hoo, he coined the term no U-turn syndrome. So he recently passed away. It was big news. And it refers to the social behavior of Singaporeans having a compliant mindset to higher authorities before proceeding with action. So he has this very interesting example. In Singapore, drivers on roads are not allowed to make a U-turn unless a sign specifically allows them to do so. But in other countries, drivers may make U-turns freely so long as a no U-turn sign is not present. So this is interesting. I went to check it out like last week. I went to road signs of different countries, and actually this is quite true. Okay? So that's the sign there in Singapore. So in other words, there is a lack of a culture of permissionless innovation. That's a term that has been used, permissionless innovation. Okay? And this is related to the wider issue of creative class and creative cultures. So according to this study by Richard Florida, some of you may know him, on the creative class, it is only in certain environments, social-political environments, which promote freedom and deviant values, so to speak, deviant values, like non-conformity and bohemianism, where creativity flourishes. So this guy, Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, criticized Singapore on this ground. When you are very structured, almost like a religion, uniforms, everybody is the same, look at structured societies like Singapore where bad behavior isn't tolerated, you are extremely punished. Where are the creative people? Where are the great artists? Where are the great musicians? Where are the great singers? Where are the great writers? Where are the athletes? All the creative elements seem to disappear. Okay, last few slides. Despite generous subsidies for the arts, the value of creative industries in Singapore has been eclipsed by Hong Kong, even in recent years when Hong Kong is said to be a cultural desert. In 2005, I actually measured this. The value of exports of creative industries in Hong Kong was 12 times that of Singapore, 12 times. This gap has closed actually to 2.74 times in favor of Hong Kong in recent years, according to United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Right? And, there are some scholars, media scholars in Singapore, Terence Lee, so on and so forth, attributing this to a tradition of censorship. There are many reasons it's complicated. Censorship, usually on conservative social harmony, political grounds, which to some extent has led to a culture of self-censorship. So this is a children's book. I think the Singaporeans in the room would know it. It's a children's book. Depicts two gay penguins. Okay? And the Singapore government said, we want to pulp this book because there were some complaints by social religious conservatives. But after further debate and furor, they decided not to destroy and pulp it. They just basically moved it somewhere else. But if you see in Singapore, Hong Kong has a vibrant creative sector as compared to Singapore, despite little government assistance. And this is not like the Hong Kong colonial governance, like funding and giving money to artists and musicians. It did not happen that way. For example, Hong Kong has an illustrious history of cantopop. The Hong Kongers in the room would know this very well. And film industry, being the third largest in the world at various points, over many decades comparable at some points to K-pop, America's Hollywood, and India's Bollywood. Everyone knows this individual, recently won an award, right? She became prominent in Hong Kong cinema before she moved to Hollywood. Okay? The Four Heavenly Kings, 是他天王, right, in Hong Kong. Right? And I remember my parents would listen to them. My mom still listens to Jackie Cheung a lot today, right? Now, I acknowledge that in recent years, over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, people say there's been a decline of Hong Kong culture. Yeah, I agree. But recently, there seems to be some resurgence since COVID. There is this this boy band in Hong Kong called Mirror, credited for the resurgence of cantopop. And last week, they released their first English single because they want to globalize cantopop, to project Hong Kong's soft power into the world context. For further information, read this book by Chu, Hong Kong, Cantopop, Hong Kong University Press. In conclusion, economic freedom and economic behavior more generally need to be studied in context. Social, cultural, historical, political context. And to operationalize such an understanding of context, I really think we need qualitative approaches. Small and thick description analysis, which I have done, shows significant qualitative differences between Hong Kong's tradition of liberal governance, even though being eroded by China over the last 10 years, versus Singapore's variety of authoritarian capitalism. Aggregate statistics may be misleading, not always flawed. I'm not saying discard statistics, please do not get me wrong. But if used without contextual understanding, can be very misleading and may even feed into structures of state power. Recall Rule of Law Index. Now, even though many market liberals are enamored with EFI and lack contextual understanding of East Asia, they are still generally correct that freedom is essential for progress. Singapore did develop rapidly under authoritarian governance. Yes, it cannot be denied, but it has high costs. And it also poses a deeper philosophical question for you to ask yourself. Is growth without freedom worth having? Yes, you have GDP, you have skyscrapers and all that, but if you do not have political freedom, is that okay? Would you accept this trade-off? Some would not. I think this is a very moral issue. It's a value judgment, right? But in Hong Kong, it's really a very special story. It's an inspiring story of progress that we should remember and cherish. But unfortunately, a lot of the unique characteristics of Hong Kong have really been watered down. That's really an understatement, right? Ever since China has started to encroach in Hong Kong. And generally, those concerned about the future of liberal democracy, nature of capitalism, and the rise of China should really study East Asian Challenge. Thank you very much. Some references, which I'm happy to send the slides. Thank you very much. There's a picture of Lee Kuan Yew there for your enjoyment.
Thank you, Brian. I've got to say, we've had a number of presentations in the last few months of some very big names. We had Cass Sunstein here a couple of weeks ago. We had Diane Coyle. But Brian has just given one of the best presentations I've heard in years. So can we give him another round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So that's a link to the book if you'd like to check it out, a promo code. But feel free to email me for further conversations. I'm happy to provide a discount or even send you a review copy if you're a student or an academic. Thank you. I guess there's some Q&A.
Thank you for that. To what extent do you feel the two cities are competing against each other, and do they need to compete with each other? And if you look forward, say 2 or 3 decades, which of the two cities do you think has the brighter outlook?
I think when it comes to the economy, there is always a degree of competition. There's always a degree of cooperation as well. I think both themes are always there. So to some extent, when we read the news today, there is some discussion of how they are competing in terms of how Singapore is attracting more skilled workers. Firms, MNCs, businesses seem to be leaving Hong Kong because of concerns over China, and that sense moving to Singapore. So in that sense, there is some degree of competition. If you think of competition in terms of attracting capital, attracting talent, attracting skilled labor, yes, to some extent. But I think, traditionally, there's also a lot of cooperation, cultural ties, social ties, political ties, which have really bonded these two countries together as well. So I think now, if you think about the context of China, and if you fall on the side of China is a threat, we should be concerned, then all the more Asian countries need to forge stronger relationships in terms of strategic partnerships, economic exchanges and cultural ties to show a united front in the face of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an extensive multivariate analysis into such an interesting topic. Just in that same manner, we can kind of see to the fact that Hong Kong and Singapore are similar in many ways, but they can also be dissimilar in many ways as well. And in that sense, how would you respond to the fact that have the citizens chosen a much more strict, as one would call, authoritarian state, or did the authoritarian state kind of impose that mindset onto the citizens?
That's an excellent question, because it gets to the heart of one of the key principles in my research, which is the link between culture and politics. Culture and politics are very interconnected. So to some extent, the social values of citizens are shaped by state policies, social engineering. So to some extent, Singaporeans, because they believe in these things, right, to some extent it's really because the state has really brainwashed, socially engineered outcomes in that sense. But what individuals do, the values that they have, to some extent can also change and evolve and then reflect back on politics and change social outcomes and political outcomes as well. So which is why you see in the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a gradual opening up of Singapore politics and civil society, right? More civil society groups, more opposition politicians. So in that sense, you can say culture is the one that's changing and then now affecting political developments. So I think culture and politics, they are always mutually constituting each other, and it's very difficult to say which came first. But it's definitely very important, and we should study this interconnection. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian, for your presentation. What you said was very thought-provoking for me. I would say like Singapore flourished under like a government controlled environment, whereas Hong Kong is a laissez-faire society, a bookcase of Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, so where you respect the individual developments. So like Singapore was very lucky to have a world-class leader, in my opinion, that led to such a growth. But looking at the Chinese history over the years, like we have good emperors and bad kings, and that led to the ups and downs of the economic development. So how sustainable is the Singapore model, whereas the old Hong Kong model is based on individual aspirations. So even things have changed, and because of this individual expression of their freedom and things like that, things flourish. So it seems to me it is a more sustainable model in terms of Hong Kong, because it relies on the individual aspirations.
Yeah. I generally agree with that sentiment, which is why you see from my presentation I'm more or less critical of the Singapore model and more in favor of the Hong Kong model. But please do not get me wrong, okay, because I think that this is going to be on film, okay? So I'm not saying that Lee Kuan Yew was a bad man, that he's a horrible man. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, in the post-war period, he did make the decision, right, to welcome multinational corporations, okay, to generally allow an open market economy. So he did that. At a time when many Southeast Asian countries were turning inwards, when they were decolonizing, many Southeast Asian nations felt that to welcome foreign MNCs and foreign entrepreneurs would be akin to neo-colonialism. So because you are trying to, be an independent nation state, you would also want to, in a sense, be closed. So what happened in, let's say, Indonesia is a great example. So yes, the Singapore developmental state under Lee Kuan Yew did actually make some good choices, right? But I'm saying that we cannot overplay this idea of great political leaders, right? And the actions of these heroic leaders, providing all the prosperity that you are dependent on. So in my account, yes, he made some good decisions, but in my historical account, geographical good luck play a very important role, and also the British inheritance play a very important role. But if you read my historical chapter, I'm not saying, we owe everything to the British. Not that as well. The British partnered with local Chinese communities in both countries. So it's really a form of Anglo-Chinese capitalism, right? So that sort of a bottom-up process is really unique, yes. And you are right, it's sustainable. I don't really see many of these bottom-up development cases in the world today. So that's why I think the Hong Kong case is so special and really worth remembering. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'd like to ask the following question. Using the concept for staying, you mentioned that economics should not be seen apart from culture and politics. Building on this, how can Europe adapt Singaporean or Hong Kongese policies to further European development? And second question is, how can European Asian development be stimulated?
Okay, those are very broad and deep questions. So how can European countries using Verstehen or deep understanding learn from the Asian context? I think it's really a case-by-case basis. You need to be very specific and discrete about what you're trying to do. Okay, so are you trying to, let's say, reform the tax code? Are you trying to improve your civil service? Are you trying to improve development outcomes in a developing country? So the sort of lessons that you would want to draw, I think must be very limited and very specific, not broad brush. Okay, so I would say it really depends on what exactly that European country or that policy maker is wishing to change and wishing to learn from. And from there, really devote time to do history, right? To do social science, to speak to people on the ground, to understand what's actually going on there before making these prescriptions to transfer. So let me give you an example. So let's say when people talk, about the UK, like planning reform, improving the civil service, improving the political service. So why look to Asia, right? Why not look back into your own history? Why not look back into best practices in British history, which may have a more similar cultural context than trying to borrow from Asia, right? But of course, we should definitely engage with Asia and really understand it, especially because of the rise of China. The rise of China and the rise of Asia, I think Westerners and Western scholars especially need to be familiar, with a different culture. So I think a great example would be learning a different language, learning Mandarin, reading Chinese sources, reading Chinese newspapers to understand really the unique cultural traits which can affect maybe what Chinese leaders are doing, right? Which can influence Chinese government in that sense. So I don't have an easy answer, but really to have discrete lessons. Yeah.
Can you take one on this side and then we'll come over to that?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this very serious, interesting discussion. And it is very interesting that I come from Hong Kong, you come from Singapore, and we are here in our former sovereign country and talking about this topic. And I think as I observe, there are many Hong Kong people here, and I'm not sure how many Singaporeans are here. We may outnumber you in terms of argument. I think your topic is very interesting, but it looks to me that you are focusing on primarily on the economic side of it, of the two cities. And I have these questions I have been wondering over the past few years, that it seems to me that China has reached a stage where the economy has grown to the second in the world, but at the same time, it has created a lot of problems for itself, and also many problems are coming up nowadays, and we can see that the economy are being its own economy are being hurt seriously. And I always have this impression that China, with the political system from 1949 up to now, they have not changed in any sense. They have been using the old jackets when they were only 100 pounds, and now they become 300 pounds, and they still wear the same clothes. So I suppose the political system is a constraint of the economic development in the long term. So in that case, I'm not sure in the future, you just mentioned that Hong Kong's success has to be remembered, economic success. And I'm not sure with the existing political system in Singapore, where you have no opposition, will that sustain in the future? I mean, 2 or 3 other generations further after Lee Kuan Yew. So this is my more serious question than your argument that the political system, I think, is the key. And as we can see in many countries, For example, in Africa, in other countries, we see that when the political system is rotten, is corrupted, is not stable, then the economy cannot thrive. So, can you shed some light on this?
Thank you very much. So I like one sentence that you said, which is the political system affects the economy and the economic outcomes, which is totally true. Okay? So in fact, I actually have another slide, okay, which I did not get to show, which is actually the next one here. So Hong Kong's political system, yes, has evolved and changed since it's been handed over to China, definitely. And this is because of what we call corporatist elements. So a lot of what I've been talking in my book, this is my book here, has really been changing over the last 10 to 20 years. So the Hong Kong that I've been describing in my presentation today, some of you may not even recognize it today, right? It's true, because my period of focus was really up towards the 1997 handover. But since then, Hong Kong's political system have actually started to involve what we call corporatist elements. What is corporatist elements? In the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, I think the Hong Kongers will know this very well, there is this thing called functional constituencies. Okay? And functional constituencies, okay, have a lot of actually business interests. Professional sectors actually being reflected. So imagine a corporation actually having a formal representation in the legislature. So according to a number of political scientists, the introduction of such corporatist elements in the Hong Kong political system started to introduce sectoral demands. So all these business interests, right, are starting to be part of the Hong Kong political structure, right? And so they are starting to demand for more special interest protections since then. So a lot of the so-called free market patterns of Hong Kong's past development has started to water down, right? And this is to some extent because of China, because China wanted to retain the support of business interests in the run-up to the handover. So they started to pressure Hong Kong to implement these sort of corporatist arrangements. So I fully agree with you. There are many political problems in the realm of political culture and political system which affects the economy. I completely agree with you. Yeah. But the time period that I'm focusing on was more before than now. So there is actually one point of irony here, because Singapore seems to be opening up politically, right? So in that sense, it's becoming a little bit like Hong Kong of the past. But now Hong Kong is experiencing this domination from China like you described it, and perhaps is moving towards a Singapore that we shouldn't want. So there's a bit of a reversal, the ironic reversal in that sense, yeah.
Two questions on this side here. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. This is such a treat, really. I so enjoyed listening to you. My question is somewhat of more general nature, but given the issues you identified, I think you are in a good position to answer this. If we go back to your first slide in terms of the you don't need to go there, in terms of the distinction between free liberals and interventionists, is it ever wise to look for one size that would fit all without worrying about history, culture, politics, all the other identification features of individual countries? We will never get there. Everybody is different and in different ways.
Which is why I favor institutional economics, because it really provides us, the tools of institutional economics provides us with rich understanding of these individual contexts and individual countries that certain scholars and certain frameworks would not be able to obtain. And your statement actually reminds me of the end of history hypothesis by Francis Fukuyama, the idea that, history has ended, countries are now converging towards liberal democracy and free market capitalism. So on one level, I agree with Fukuyama in the sense that there are no real ideological challenges to capitalism and democracy. I agree with that to some extent. But then again, nations have not converged on a single model. There are a lot of different varieties of capitalism, and they diverge. And so we really need to understand these divergence and local context if we are to make an informed judgment of what's going on. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you very much for your impressive presentations. Yes, just a quick comment. I have some reservations of the idea of if we solely focus the cooperative system on the legislative council after the handover or just before the handover, because if I'm not mistaken, even before in 1960s and 70s, in colonial era, the executive council of the Hong Kong government is also filled with the business tycoons like Jardine, Loswire. So I would see it's more about, because of the legislative structure, the business interests more diversified or become more competitive with each other rather than simply promoting an industrial policy demands before. So I guess this dynamic also leads to the current situation when the Chinese government try to reform the legislature and bring more Chinese capitalists to infiltrate or to intervene in a political structure. And my second question is, because when you mentioned the issue of the rule of law between Singapore and Hong Kong, and you introduced the excellent work of Jovi Raja's authoritarian rule of law, one of the idea Jovi mentioned about the legal system in Singapore is about the dual state. When they have a dual state legal system, they have a fully functional legal system for economic disputes, but on the other hand, they repress civil liberties through the system. So this is a very similar situation in Hong Kong right now. But nowadays, when Hong Kong introduced such kind of a dual state legal system with the national security law, it draws a lot of geopolitical responses. But in Singapore, it didn't happen. So how do you foresee the geopolitical factor in these comparisons in the future? Thank you.
Very difficult questions. I'll try to answer it. Okay, for the first one, you talked about the corporatist element. So you are totally right, because I didn't have time to really elaborate in depth. So I agree with you. These corporatist elements actually originated and started a lot even during the colonial era, but it was really towards the handover when these elements started to become more and more prominent. So yes, you are right. The business interests. That's why I have this point here, the bullet point. Big firms like Jardine, right? Yes. Given seats in the executive council, elites and business leaders appointed. Yes, I agree with you. So historically, as a historical fact, yes, that's true. But the corporatism was, I would say, more entrenched, right, in the past 10 to 20 years under the banner of China. In the case of the rule of law, I agree with you. It's complex. I'm not sure how to respond. Yeah. But I guess the key point I would say is rule of law is not perfect. In Singapore and Hong Kong and in any countries, it's not perfect. But we must understand that rule of law, right, okay, in an authoritarian context, it's not the rule of law that restricts state power, that checks and balances the state. It's not the sort of rule of law that comes with reference to individual rights. You see? So yes, there is rule of law in Singapore. I'm not saying there's no rule of law, but the rule of law is in the context of authoritarianism. But in the Hong Kong context, I'm not talking about under China, for the longest time, there was really an arm's length relationship. There was this sort of benign neglect between the colonial governance and Hong Kong society, right? And indeed, the rule of law in Hong Kong was not perfect. It was never perfect. In fact, for most of Hong Kong's history, right, there was imperfect legal adjudication. It was left to the Chinese communities in traditional organizations to resolve disputes. It was only in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when the formal legal process in Hong Kong started to be strengthened by Great Britain itself in anticipation of a handover to China. So it's a gradual improvement in the rule of law and by no means perfect. But I totally agree with you also that in the last 10 or 20 years, law has also been used as an instrument of China. For example, the national security law. And in fact, there are some Hong Kong activists, pro-democracy activists in a room here today, and I truly respect you. Yeah.
Okay, we have the lady here, sorry.
Yeah, can I just repeat that I want to thank you for your presentation. It's really good because I can really focus throughout the whole hour, and that doesn't happen. And because it's really good. My question is simple and short. So after the handover, And so Hong Kong's democracy and civil liberty has been eroded seriously. But because of the growing tie with the Chinese system, does it, on the other hand, do you observe improved labor mobility from mainlanders?
Improved labor mobility from mainlanders in the sense of people from the mainland moving to Hong Kong or moving to other Asian countries?
From mainland China to Hong Kong for work.
I don't have the statistics right off the top of my head, but I suppose there has always been the mobility of labor between these countries. But I guess to the extent that people are concerned about the situation in Hong Kong, the flow of labor may not be going to Hong Kong. Perhaps they may be going to other Asian countries, which they find to be safer and more certain. That's the reason why there are actually reports saying that people from China or even from Hong Kong, other Asian countries, are actually going to Singapore, because it's actually a more stable sort of a system. So I don't have the specific data for you, but I would imagine there are people who are concerned and therefore may not want to move to Hong Kong. Yeah.
A couple of people on this side have been waiting, so
Sorry. Actually, could I just start by maybe providing a little bit of an answer to the question that had just been. I think it's also worth remembering that for most of Hong Kong's history, there wasn't a physical border, so there was free movement of people from what is now mainland China into Hong Kong, and the border, in many ways, was a product of the closing off of China in itself. So it wasn't necessarily about Hong Kong pushing people out as much as China wishing to keep people in. But I just wanted to come back to the point that Eric raised earlier, which I think is a very good thing. And, sorry for focusing so much on the Hong Kong legislature here, but I think you're missing something. And I think I'm quite sure you've thought about this, but maybe you've missed it so far in the discussion. Is it really about, when we're looking at the functional constituencies, is it really about sort of corporate interest here? Or is it actually about how corporate interest has changed? Now, if you look at Hong Kong history, and when we look at, the Legislative Council, of course, evolved. And it evolved essentially from a mechanism which the colonial government used in order to hear out what the business interests were. So the relationship of power was to say, we don't have legitimacy, therefore it is particularly important to have good information. And what I would say ties into Singapore. In your presentation, you were sort of saying, a technocratic state operates by how good its information is, how important it is to have that data. One of the problems we've seen in Hong Kong, certainly I would say, in the last, since 2014, I think has been a particular problem, is that there are big questions about the information that Beijing is getting on Hong Kong. And there's big questions about, let's say, the function of these functional constituencies. Are they really representing the viewpoints and the concerns of the business interests there? Or are they actually being brought in, essentially, to help Beijing control the loyalty of the legislature? So that's what I'm asking.
Yes, actually, I do not disagree with you whatsoever. So corporate interests have always played a part in Hong Kong's history. And the colonial governors and officials have always worked with them, partnered with them, allowed them representation in various forms. That's totally true. And even without considering China and the role of China, there's always been concern about some corporate interests and large firms actually dominating certain parts of the Hong Kong economy, right? So there are concerns about, let's say, big firms dominating the real estate sector, dominating land and property markets, right? And to the extent that that is true, there are some social problems and social issues that have arisen from there. I completely agree, yes. And so whether or not these corporate interests genuinely reflect the views of the Hong Kong people, or are they used as some sort of political mechanism, I guess I'm quite skeptical. In fact, most of the literature that I've read have actually shown that these functional constituencies and the changes since 1997 were initially introduced as that political mechanism that you described, actually, where they were put in place to, in a sense, diffuse tensions, right? Because Hong Kong did not want these capitalists to flee, right? So by incorporating them more fully within a certain structure, they would still be given a voice, but yet not in a fully democratic sense, as it were. So I agree with your general point that corporate interests have always changed, their relationships have changed, and there is a very unique relationship that they have now with the Chinese state. Yeah.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So there's one person just next to you, Sam, just there. And then, yeah.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I wish they taught this in social studies in Singapore.
I can hear from your accent you are Singaporean.
Of course. Actually, I like two things that you mentioned. The first is this idea of state-led development naturally, but second and more interestingly, social engineering.
Yes.
And the state as an entrepreneur.
Yes.
So combining those two together, I think originally the strategy for the state was largely top-down.
Yes.
But increasingly, obviously, to have a technocratic state, you need a large civil service, of which you are part of.
Yes.
So within the civil service, therefore, and originally that the whole reason for this economic drive and the idea of conformity was for national interest, which I think has then been engendered in the junior civil servants as time went by. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, especially the institutional learning and knowledge of the service. Do you think that perhaps to achieve your end goal, we need a smaller service, or our entrepreneurs have all gone to service and we need them back in the private sector? Or, what would you advise perhaps head civil service to do in that lens? I'm curious on the technocratic dimension. Thanks.
That's a great question. I shall answer that with a story. So when I was a civil servant, one of my bosses was a senior civil servant for a few decades. And I was from Enterprise Singapore. We are involved in the provision of industrial grants and subsidies to promote technological upgrading, human capital upgrading, business upgrading, and the like. So I think on my first week of the job, I asked my boss, what do you think is one of the greatest weaknesses of this Singapore developmental state, the economic strategy? And he said to me, the Singapore government gives out too much grants and subsidies to the small medium enterprises, which are the target of our agency. So I said, but if that's actually the problem, then why are you still doing it? But this is what we are doing in this department, right? But you are saying that this is the biggest weakness. So doesn't that question your very existence, right? So I asked him, how do you reconcile this? He said, because of politics, because of path dependence, because a lot of business firms and Singaporeans are just used to such a system where a lot of support and grants are just provided. Today, tonight, if I want to, I can obtain a 70% government grant to cover some of my business expense. Like tomorrow, I can buy a laptop for business and I can claim it 70% from the government. So this concern about entrepreneurship and all that has been around. It's not unique to me. Other Singapore scholars, Linda Lim, Linda Low, all that, have been talking about this. But I think there has been a path dependence. There's a path dependence effect, and it's difficult to change because of the political incentives, I would say, of the Singapore politicians. It's just difficult to change what's been etched for a long time. But they are trying.
It just occurred to me, actually, when Brian, you mentioned the corporatist elements being introduced into the LegCo in Hong Kong. Would there be similarities like in the American system? You've got a revolving door system anyway, right? Where someone might be senator one day, next day they are retired, and then then wouldn't that be the case? There's always representation of corporatist elements in any system of government. Yeah.
You are totally right, yes. So, big business and corporate influences, they will always try to capture the state for their purposes. So I accept that basic premise, right? So certainly we see in the United States there's a lot of corporate influence. there's rent-seeking behavior, right? Certainly, and I think to the extent that inequalities, special interests, special privileges arise from the close connection of business and state, I think that is to be condemned. I think that's to be criticized. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that it's a bit unique in Hong Kong because these seats are literally businesses who have actual seats, right? So you don't have, let's say, Google having a seat, let's say, in the Senate. But of course, you can say, yeah, okay, they donate lots of campaign finances and the politicians are really literally bought by the corporations. Perhaps you could make that claim. Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I'm sure I agree with you that corporate influence is always a real concern everywhere. Yeah.
Okay, we've done an hour and a half. We've had a lot of questions. I think Brian has done just the most remarkable job, actually. So, well, I think we need to give him another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.